All right, so let's take a look at immigration patterns as of 1900. So this graph is very telling of what we've been talking about. Germans made up a majority of the pie. And the other category, 25%, we didn't really track immigration from 1840 to roughly 1860. I mean, you just came on boats and we didn't bother to know who you were. You just talked funny. So, I mean, we could guess you were Irish or something like that, but there's no record of people landing. Records weren't really extensively kept until, Ellis Island and a little bit before that. But the guess is that the 25% were mostly German and Irish. Now, if you take a look, Scandinavian England, Scandinavia is Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and then you have England. And if you take a look, what immigrant group comprised the most of immigrants, and there you are, Germans. And you can see out west, they outnumbered other groups. Like the Irish, really the only way the Irish made it out west was working on the railroad. You don't see a lot of, so Mexico, China, Japan they split at 1.5%. So we talk about Chinese and Japanese immigration, but they didn't make up a big chunk of immigration at the time. So I mean, even Germans, they made it out to California. They had a lot more time. I mean, between 1840 and 1900 to make it out there. But you can see that Germans so New York obviously is over here. Massachusetts, the Irish stuck in Massachusetts, that's where you get like Boston and the Celtics, that's a Irish thing, the Celts. But you can tell by the bars that it was a lot easier for Germans to move west and farm. Ohio, again, Germans. The English had a pretty good time, but again, the English were only about 8%. So immigrants face discrimination. So nativism. They called themselves Native Americans, not Indian, like Indians, Native Americans, but these are people, white people, who could trace their roots back to, I don't know, the founding fathers, or, one of the boats that came over on or one of the boats that came after the Mayflower or something like that. They considered themselves Native Americans. So they discriminated against non-native born people. So basically immigrants. Okay, this is where you start to see, immigrants being, any immigrant group was really discriminated against, but this is where you start to see it in the United States. So they targeted the Irish and then the Italians, and nativists targeted the Irish because they were Catholic, and the natives were Protestant. You did have German Protestants come over, and you had German Catholics, but you didn't see a lot of discrimination because you saw a lot of them move west, and you did see large groups in New York and stuff like that, but they weren't really hassled like the Irish were. And then the Italians, though, they came in like 1890s, and the Italians were Catholic too. And what's funny is if you're Irish and your family came over in like 1850, by the time the Italians came over in 1890, your grandpa was the Irishman who came over. So you're the grandson of an Irish immigrant. Then the Irish come in, and you're American. You start discriminating against the Italians coming in. So you do what was done to you. So mainly Protestants discriminate against Catholics. It was a religious thing. Some of the first anti-abortion laws were Protestants forbidding abortion because Catholics were having too many children. Oh, that's what Protestants said. And they were afraid they were going to be outnumbered by Catholics. So here's a political cartoon. It's kind of caricature, racist caricature. So this is a Chinese person. This is a Japanese person. And they're swallowing Uncle Sam. It says that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. So it's the idea that, these incoming immigrants are changing the face of America. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? White immigration, Oriental. Oriental is Chinese, Japanese. We don't call them Oriental anymore. It's not really a term that we use anymore. And white immigration. Now, you could probably, if you go back into the video or look at your lecture notes, you probably know why white immigration, so European immigration, they were let in, but Oriental or Chinese and Japanese immigration, they weren't let in. Also, take a guess at what coast whites came in, and then what coast Asians came in on. So that's you should probably know your geography on that one. We'll do that in class. Okay, challenges of urbanization. We sort of talked about this a bit, but it's worth going over again. Immigrants settle into cities, and like I said in the last unit, the increase in population was due to immigrants coming in, not necessarily people having more babies. Well, you had more babies living, which will increase the population. But immigration was the biggest increase, the biggest reason for an increase in population. Many Irish settled into unskilled jobs, which is like push a button or pull a lever. The Germans had pretty skilled jobs. Maybe they became bosses within a factory. The Germans they came over literate and things like that, could do math. The Irish, on the other hand, were mainly, not really literate. Cultures grouped together because of language and customs. It's easy to, get along economically if you speak the same language and have the same customs, eat the same food. And also safety. If the Protestants are attacking Catholics, you don't want to be a Catholic family living in the middle of a Protestant neighborhood. And the Irish, they were too poor to move west. Same with the Italians, they were too poor to move west. And then countryside technology, we talked about this, enclosure, and then former slaves moves west. This is from the last unit. So here's a picture of the New York skyline. 1876, no skyscrapers. 1932, you start to see, this bridge isn't even built right here. You start to see the beginnings, and then Trade Tower, 88, and then obviously 9/11. And this has already been built. Freedom Tower has already been built. So just take a look at the growth. I think it's kind of a cool picture. And then this is an artist's rendering because they did not have color photography when New York was just woods. Don't get that confused. But this is what the city landscape looked like before white people settled. Just a bunch of forest land and stuff like that. So you can see how they all group together. So check it out, Germans, largest group. Russian, this is 1910. Russians came over 1900, 1910 because of political issues. The Irish, there weren't that many Irish in New York, so if you were to take a similar snapshot of like Boston, you'd see more green. Okay, urban problems. You had housing. It was cramped and unhealthy. They lived in what were called tenements. And a tenement was basically like a wooden apartment that could easily catch fire if you dropped a lantern. It was kind of sad, like you'd have people who moved in and you'd have a disease outbreak, and then the city workers or something, they didn't have city workers, but the landlord would hire some people to, bring out the bodies and cart them off. And then when new immigrants came in, they'd refill the tenement where everyone got sick and died. And I'll show you some pictures. There's also a video where you'll see it's like really cramped and terrible. An absentee landlord, if you live in an apartment building, you probably have someone who runs the apartment building living in the apartments too. And I think that's actually law that they have to do that. because it's really easy to neglect a apartment building if you don't live there. You know, all you're interested in is rent money. And then transportation. A lot of people need to get in the cities from point A to point B, and they had horses. And last unit we talked about this problem with horse exhaust. And then water. Water was unhealthy. Sanitation. Lots of trash. Not like boxes of mac and cheese and stuff like that, but rotten food, bread, dead animals. Lots of dead animals. Unreliable sewers. So even if you did have a sewer, it didn't mean that it would back up and flood a basement or something like that. So you'd have like a pool of poo. And they didn't have an understanding of what we call today germ theory, that there are these little creatures that'll make you sick. If you went around saying that there were little creatures that made you sick, they'd lock you up. They did that to a guy. I can never remember his name. He came up with the theory of, germ theory. There's little critters that make you sick. They locked him up in a mental institution. And then a couple of scientists later were like, oops, he's right. Crime, mostly theft, not like murder or anything. Murder's always been consistent. I mean, okay, you pack more people together, the murder rate doesn't go up. It's just that, you're going to see more murders, but that's because you have more people. But the likelihood that you'll be murdered is low. And there weren't enough police. He started to have to use police, people who would, patrol and try to prevent crimes. And in certain areas, the Irish were attracted to the job. Police didn't get a lot of respect back then either. They sort of had to earn it. And then fire, you had limited water supply, wooden buildings, and all firefighters were like, almost all firefighters were volunteer firefighters. So you have the problems, you have these urban problems. So you try to find some urban solutions. You had a lot of homeless African Americans and women, like if your husband died, you couldn't afford the rent in your tenement, so you were kicked out on the street with your kids. So you have a woman named Jane Addams, and she started what was called Hull House. So houses that would house women who, not all of them. I mean, there was never enough for the demand. The supply was always really low. And it cultivated a social responsibility for the poor, which means that basically society is responsible for making sure that the neediest among us are taken care of. Preached against social Darwinism, and I discussed that last unit. Social Darwinism, again, is the idea that some people just aren't fit to live because of economic reasons, but that isn't what Darwin said. And if the system is rigged, you may hear like, inequality, like privilege. There we are, privilege. That white people have privilege, other minorities do not. And that's not saying that you specifically have privilege, but there are systems set up that benefit white people more than they would other minorities. For example, cocaine, if you were caught with an ounce of cocaine, you got a lower sentence in jail than if you were caught with an ounce of crack. Well, who snorted cocaine? White people. Who smoked crack? Black people. Well, that seems fair, don't it? And then you have what's called the social gospel movement. And basically it was a religious movement. And basically what that was is, if on your way to church you have to step over a homeless man, you're like, ew, gross, get a job, and you go to church, pray to God, help the poor, and then go home and step over his corpse, they would say you're not doing it right. So we're going to skip ahead a bit. Pre-World War I's like 1900 to 1910. You start to see Italians, and they're rural, southern Italians, like Sicily and other places, mostly farmers. Central Europe, you have all your rich Italians. I had a boss who, his parents moved here from Central Europe, so he was Italian. And I mean, Italians are usually, the stereotype, dark skin, and they go, Mamma Mia, and they do all that stuff. But Central European Italians or Central Europeans don't fit that stereotype. You wouldn't know he was Italian. He was just a white guy. And then the Eastern European incursion. So you started to see revolutions, communist revolutions happen in Russia and labor strikes and stuff. And then you started to see these Russians come over. And for a majority of them, they were just fleeing, terrible conditions. And but people in the United States felt that they were also a threat, like, ooh, Russians, isn't bad stuff happening in Russia? Oh, they're bringing in the bad stuff. And you see that today in Europe with Muslims, unfortunately. You have extremist groups in Europe who say, Muslims, they're, coming in and screwing up our country, and blah, blah, blah. In any given population of people, 5% screwed up for everyone else. And so you start to see a wave of anti-communism, even though the people coming over may not have even been communist. And in 1920, you have like what's called a Red Scare, and you have what are called anarchists. Also in usually before and after World War I. Anarchists really did want to use violence. They came from Italy mainly, and they did want to use violence, but they didn't. It wasn't a lot of them. You could have been an anarchist, but moved, to the United States. So you start to see this resurgence of nativism. So you had nativism with the Irish coming in after and during the Civil War. Kind of dies down a bit, and then it pops back up before World War I. KKK membership grows, and they favor certain immigrants, basically British immigrants or Scandinavian immigrants over Italian immigrants or Eastern European immigrants. And they want restrictions, and we'll talk about those restrictions. And then on the side, it isn't immigration, it's migration. During this time, you start to see when cities really grow and they become attractive. You have clubs where music's played and places to meet up and stuff. And black people start to see that the North is more hospitable than the South, or at least that's what they think. And it is to a certain extent. Instead of being called names, we all know that name that black people can be called, and being beaten up in the South. You may just be called the name and then not get a job in the North, so at least you're not getting beat, but, by the same token, it's pretty horrible that the whole country is racist like that. So with the surge in immigration, the government reacts. You have what were called the Palmer raids. So Palmer was the attorney general, so it's like the lawyer for the United States. And him and few other government officials had their houses bombed, and he survived, but he had a kid, so it really riled him up. And he started raiding homes and meeting places of suspected anarchists and would violate, the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment as well. You don't have to incriminate yourself, or you don't have to be, unlawfully search and have your property seized. But he fell out of favor because of just these tactics he was taking. And then you have Sacco and Vanzetti, kind of an interesting, sad story. So back then, if you got your paycheck, there was a different office you went to at your work, and they'd hand you actual cash. You'd line up, and they'd hand you cash for your time card. And your job lets out at 5, but the accounting department has to get the money from the bank. So these two guys robbed the payroll. Basically, they robbed the bags of money they were getting to pay their employees. And they were suspected anarchists, the people who robbed the place, and the descriptions were vague. So the cops pick up two guys, Sacco and Vanzetti. And the only evidence the police have against Sacco and Vanzetti is that Sacco owned a gun. That's the only evidence, and they were convicted and executed. based on the evidence that Sacco owned a gun. They couldn't even match the bullets, you know. So it's like, you know, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that the security guard was shot and killed. So it was a murder trial, but they were held accountable for it and executed. During World War I, you have what's called the Espionage and Sedition Act. So these were easily passed through. And the Sedition Act, it is a challenge to the First Amendment. Can you criticize your government during a time of war? The Sedition Act said no. So if you criticized your government during a time of war, you could be arrested, thrown in jail for 20 years. And that happened to someone who actually ran for president. He criticized Wilson and ended up in jail. And there's another guy who criticized Wilson. He was just handing out pamphlets. He wasn't saying, you know, here's what Wilson said and here's where Wilson lied. That's all he was doing, handing out pamphlets, handing out part of the Constitution. And he got arrested and went to the Supreme Court. And he was still found guilty. And then they do immigration restrictions against certain European groups. So at first, we'd only let in 3%. So out of 100 Eastern Europeans who wanted to leave, we'd only let in 3. And then the next year, we dropped it down to 2. So here's Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco supporting the stash. And then this is anarchist bombing. So yeah, anarchists were dangerous. Bombing of Wall Street. What's sad, though, is the bomb went off and took out chauffeurs and you know, the little people, the little people they're trying to liberate, killed them, and didn't get any rich people in the bombing. And then, so this is 1920, so this is after World War I. And then here's the KKK march. You'll never see anything like this again. I mean, yeah, you see Nazis in the streets and stuff like that, but this whole organized with flags and marching down, you can see white all the way back. You'll never see anything like that again, thank God. But yeah, Nazis in the streets. I mean, seeing that today, it's a little like, huh, I thought my grandfather shot them all, kind of thing. But yeah, apparently we have Nazis, and they're in the streets. So the IWW was a communist union, and then the Bolsheviki is the revolutionaries in Russia. And what they're doing is they're sort of stalking this angry laborer, and they're trying to get their hands on this angry laborer to, and I mean, the guy just wants maybe like a higher wage or something like that. But once the IWW and the Bolsheviks get their claws and their hands on the guy, they're gonna radicalize him and turn him into a communist. So you have, you know, Red Scare is a communist scare. This is Eugene Debs, and he's the guy who was thrown in jail for 20 years. He ran for president from jail, which is pretty good. He was thrown in jail for talking smack against President Wilson under the Sedition Act. Oh, and the Espionage Act. Oh, forgot about that. The Espionage Act is spying. Espionage is spying. So don't spy against the United States. They'd specifically call it treason, so you could be executed for spying. And we'll talk about the Rosenbergs later. That was in the 50s. So this didn't go away. This popped back up in the 50s after World War II because we were afraid of the Russians. Yeah, funnel cartoon. I'm going to hand that out in class. We'll stop there for this video.